What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. See, there's a little bit of delay, so it looks like I'm doing an ad-lib thing with my voiceover and the camera, but hopefully that's not happening on your end. We got a great show for you today. James Mcbeath from Jackson Kayak, who's the marketing director for Jackson Kayak, has been paddling. I mean, he's ancient. He's got to be 85 years old. He's in the background just doing this, by the way. But anyway, he's got a lot of experience kayaking, and so we're going to bring him on to talk about something that I think is kind of lost with kayak fishing, and that is the actual kayaking part. Too many times we get caught up in what techniques to use to catch fish, and we forget about that we're actually in a kayak, and learning some techniques when it comes to paddling and how to control the boat and maintain boat position is a huge thing. We got Jose watching from Puerto Rico. Thanks for joining us, Jose. So if you guys have any questions, what's up, Brad? Again, what's up, Jose? But if you guys have any questions while we're doing this, feel free to post them up in the comments. We're also going to reference some different books and some places you can find more information on how to learn some of the paddle techniques that we talk about, because I'm sure since we're not on the water, trying to explain some of these is going to get quite interesting. So let us know where you're watching from, too. Thanks for letting us know you're there in Puerto Rico. I would love to get to Puerto Rico. It's a place I've never actually been to. Been to Costa Rica, been to Panama, but would love to go to Puerto Rico. I've seen some giant tarpon and stuff come out of there. What's up, T-Roy? I'm guessing that's not Troy. It's T-Roy. So what's up, man? Thanks for joining us. All right, I'm going to bring James on without any more. There he is, the myth.
Hi, everybody.
The sort of kind of legend.
I can hear you when you're doing the whole monologue intro thing.
Yeah, but you can't say anything. So that's like the perfect time for me to say things about you. By the way, he is my boss, so when I talk bad about him, there could be consequences.
Salary went down 10% already, so there's that. There we
go. Got Dustin Nichols, 10% nothing's nothing.
Sponsored by Dr. Feelgood. Isn't that a great name for a beer?
That's a great name for a beer. I'm doing a fine Pilsner this afternoon.
There we go.
It's award-winning. It says it right on the label. It doesn't say what award. It doesn't say what award, but it was award-winning.
It's the Chablis of beer.
Dustin Nichols is joining us.
Hey, Dustin.
Brad's joining us from Texas. Of course, Jean Wilson is on. I would say she's Jackson Kayak's biggest fan, but I think it's the other way around. We're probably her biggest fans.
Actually, it's just mine. I'm just everywhere. And
she's, of course, joining us from North Florida. But again, I wanted to have you on because I know you used to do some instructing when it comes to paddling and kayaking, more pertaining to the whitewater side of things. But you are a two-time world champion kayak fisherman. So let's get some of your
direction.
Let's get some, because you're just like, of course I am. I've only competed in 2 world championships and I won them both. Give me some background information about yourself, things that I may know but others here might not.
So if we're sticking with the kind of the paddling genre, as they say in Puerto Rico, I speak their language. Bonjour. It's just fun to me. I kind of grew up kayaking. My dad was the senior engineer for Environment Canada, so we spent a lot of time on rivers and lakes. We do a lot of camping. One day, Buddy got into this kayaking thing, and I think I was about 11 years old, and we went to a rafting company and we saw a kayak. He saw a kayaker. He rafting that day, and he decided he wanted to do kayaking. So we both kind of tried it our own. And of course, this is whitewater kayaking. And of course, we made the ultimate mistake in deciding to, if we could sit in the boat, we could clearly go down the river. What can go wrong? So luckily, the Ottawa River is nice and forgiving, and so we swam most of the rapids in the Ottawa River that day, but I was hooked, and I've been kayaking ever since.
But is that where you got the name The Brave that you have at the end of your title there?
I think that just stuck with me from the last show I did. I can't remember if I used the same software.
Sure, Indiana James the Brave.
I'm certainly not the Brave, but I think I'm definitely deserving of a title. That's why the Sir. But we watch too much Game of Thrones. My career kind of went two ways, two separate paths. One into IT and marketing, and the other one, we started a buddy of mine and I, like three buddies and I, started Liquid Skills on the Ottawa, which is a whitewater kayak school. So by the time I was, 18, 19, I was right into it. The Ottawa is a bastion for kayaking. This is where EJ hangs out. This is where Ken Whiting grew up. But this is where literally it's the core, the heartbeat of the freestyle industry, especially. So kayaking, I was just surrounded by it. And then Liquid Skills was a school that we founded, and it lasted 10 years. Still around today, but I was involved for 10 years teaching. And then we started Kayak Futalafu in there somewhere. So I was teaching in Chile. So kayaking's been around for a while.
Yeah, and so you kind of came full circle with that, combining the two, the IT and marketing, and the kayaking side when you started at Jackson. And how long have you been at Jackson? You've been here as long as I have. I know, and longer because you were here when I came. So.
Yeah, so EJ and I met in the early 90s. And that was right when my company in Montreal was going through its heyday. We were actually acquired by a major U.S. firm, and I turned into like really big guy. I was out of shape. I spent 2 years whining and dining all across America, meetings and stuff like that. And then at some point, I just kind of looked down and went, yeah, I need to make a change. So I left that, spent a year with Liquid Skills on the water, and then kind of created my own web firm, specifically focused on outdoor manufacturers. And it was really, EJ was starting Jackson and I was kind of going that way, and we're like, well, might as well work together. So it kind of came through.
Awesome. So again, what I wanted to do today is, I think, like I said, people get caught up in the fishing side of it. And most people that come into kayak fishing are fishermen. You don't see a ton of people that are already kayakers that are like, hey, I'm going to get into fishing. It happens. But from working retail and just being in this industry, like most of the people that come in are like, hey, I love to fish. I'm currently in a canoe, or I'm walking the bank or whatever, and I've been seeing people doing it in kayaks, and I want to try it out. And they don't have any previous knowledge of like paddling or kayaking or the right gear, or even, how to choose the right size paddle. So, knowing that you have that background of teaching paddling, I appreciate you coming on, and let's get into some tips that could help people, be more efficient out on the water, but also be safer and more comfortable, and maybe be able to spend more time out there. And I know that right now with like pedal drives being such a big thing, that again, people don't think about paddling as much, but pedal drives are mechanical and sometimes they fail and you have to paddle, but also a lot of times they just don't make as much sense in certain situations as, just a good paddle kayak does. Like if you're going down the Ottawa, for example, or in, small river with
you can do it.
But why? So yeah, let's just start with like, okay, you got that kayak, and now it's time to pick a paddle. What would you recommend for people to try to help come up with the right paddle for them and length and everything?
So because I'm such an old guy, I can get, I can go back to my, the old days, we didn't have that many different sized kayaks. You'll have your whitewater kayak, which is short. It spins on a dime. You really didn't need a long paddle because you didn't want your, if your paddle blade was too far out, and that's kind of a general thing. If it's too far out, you're going to spin around in a circle. You're not going to get, and if it's too close to you, you're not going to get enough power. So you got to, depending on what kind of kayak you're paddling and how long it is and how well it tracks, there's a whole bunch of these, and how wide it is, how long your arms are. There's a bunch of criteria that kind of you need to step back and look at. But the bottom line is it's comfort. And you were talking earlier about fishermen getting into kayaking, and this is I'm going to ruin a whole article. It's like a 2,500 word article I just wrote for Paddle World magazine about fishermen becoming kayakers. And, in a nutshell, it's about you getting used to the kayak.
Right.
Your first kayak, you're gonna sit in a used kayak or something, and you're gonna try it for the first time. Someone's gonna give you a paddle, and you're gonna grab it, and you're just gonna think it's normal. And then when you go out every day, you're gonna start thinking, okay, you're feeling that certain things aren't as convenient or aren't as effective when it comes to driving your kayak forward or turning your kayak or backing your kayak up. All these things become a personal feel, but there's definitely general rules, and the two things I always look at are basically how big you are. If you're a big person, you got long arms, you don't want a short, tiny little paddle because you look like a pterodactyl. It also is really ineffective if your paddles, the good news is long arms like me, I've pretty long arms, 6 foot tall, and you got long arms too. You can actually make sure your stroke reaches to the outside of your boat, some of these wide boats.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, you're looking for what's most comfortable for you.
Yeah, and that's hard to do without just spending time on the water. So that's why even with the kayak, I always recommend people, going to a demo day and spending time in the kayak you're going to get. But it's also important to once you pick that kayak to start playing around with a couple of different lengths of paddle to find that one, like you said, that feels the most comfortable.
Yeah. So the longer boats aren't going to turn as fast. So if you have a short boat and you take a long paddle and you do a big stroke, it's going to turn that boat too much. And then you're going to be fighting the turn the whole time. You're doing a zigzag right across the whole lake. So you want to find a shorter paddle for, you want to find the right length of paddle for those long boats. What I usually recommend is you start just a little shorter than what they're recommending. So there's a lot of websites, Werner, Bending Branches, all these sites have, some of them have really cool wizard systems where you can put your body weight in there, your arm lengths and all that kind of stuff. At least it gives you a starting point. There's also, the difference between your entry-level paddle, the paddle that's, not as expensive as the full-on carbon paddles that are super lightweight. The difference is just weight. And the good news is, in my opinion, when you're starting out, a little bit more weight in the paddle is a good thing. Yeah. You get a better feel for it. You're also kind of building your own style of paddling, and this is where I do a lot of my, it's like going golfing with that guy who's always giving you criticism. I'm that guy. So when you're paddling and I see you just using your arms, for example, I'll get you to move your body a little bit, and I'll give you the basics on how to create the paddler's box, which is, kind of how you set up your paddling.
Yeah, I want to get into a little bit of that too here in a minute, more of the actual body technique once we
dial
down the paddle.
One of the weaknesses, if you will, when it comes to kayak fishing, and it's kind of unique, is that if you think about it, whitewater kayak has had instruction in its midst for decades. There's been whitewater schools, and it's needed, right? You shouldn't just drop into kayaks. There's clubs that really help you with instruction for sure, but whitewater kayaking isn't something you just go out and try unless you're like that natural talent who gets it right away.
Yeah.
And touring is another, there's touring schools everywhere. You can learn how to cruise in these big, long 17-footers. There's schools everywhere for that, especially in the coastal areas. Not so much for kayak fishing. Yeah. Kayak fishing technically is touring kayaking, but you're sitting on top. Right. A lot of the boats, anything, in my opinion, anything over, 14, 15 feet, you're in a touring kayak, and anything under that, you're kind of bridging the gap in an all water kayak. So you are challenged with the fact that we don't really have an educational infrastructure out there. There's a couple places that you can go, like paddleeducation.com, and there's a couple books you and I were talking about. Ken Whiting's book, Heliconia Press's book, Kayak Fishing: The Ultimate Guide. There's a few places you can go to get the basics, but there's nothing out there. You're basically left to the laurels of you kind of getting your own feel for kayaking especially the clubs are really good at that. You go to the end of a lot of these clubs, if you look for tournament trails and clubs, they're all groups of people that hang out on the weekend, and they'll show you a new paddle, they'll show you new techniques and stuff like that. So that's kind of how kayak anglers are learning nowadays versus formal education, which is a big difference.
I know for me, when I first kind of got into it and realized I knew nothing after flipping kayak and losing gear and this and that, and I think it was actually Jim's actually on here watching, but Jim's Salmon's show, the kayak fishing show, I was a fan of that. And you mentioned Ken Whiting a couple times. Jim does say that you use your paddle upside down, and I want to get into what that actually means in a minute. But that is just a dig or poke at James from Jim, because it's one of Jim's pet peeves. But I was watching his show, and Ken Whiting used to do a paddling tip of the week on his show. And it was basically, here's a technique or here's a certain stroke or whatever. And it got me to thinking, like, hey, these things exist, and you have to think outside of fishing. You kind of remove that from your Google search, and you just look up paddle technique or kayaking techniques. And I know, I think it's called Paddling Tales. I think I pulled it up earlier, but
Paddle Tales, yeah.
Paddle Tales. It's Heliconia, and Ken does a lot of it, but it's their like paddling YouTube channel, and there's a ton of great information from choosing the right length paddle and from different strokes and stuff that we're going to touch on. But those resources are there as long as you kind of remove fishing from the search and think outside the box, because it's relatively the same techniques that you would need in a fishing kayak. Like you said, I mean, it's mostly like a touring kayak, flat water boat is what you're fishing out of, so it's going to be the same thing. And I know go ahead.
Sorry, the real difference between touring and the reason it's hard to bridge sometimes, not hard to bridge, but the reason the big difference is the width of the boats that are changing. And that's where this whole, like I said earlier, where I started earlier, we had short boats for whitewatering and long boats for touring. And you had two more distincter, which I think is a word,
it is now,
series of paddles to choose from. Well, now you've got, a 26-inch wide 15-foot boat, and you've got a 38-inch wide 15-foot boat. Neither of them paddle the same way.
Right.
Some wider ones, Jacksons, really accommodate for really, we have really good design. Tony Lee has really made great boats out of his hulls so that the tracking and all that good kayak stuff has been kind of accommodated for. But it's really hard to kind of pigeonhole what the perfect paddle is between your own body needs and your lengths and everything, and these widths and lengths that are just changing daily and all over the map.
I think if I had to put a good starting point, let's say you're in a more narrow boat, like one of our Krakens or something like that, or even more narrow, you're probably not going to be under a 220 for those of you that are looking for that size. And that's a good starting point. Most people nowadays are in that 250 plus range, but I still tend to be more of a high angle. And when I say that, James kind of touched on it earlier. I happen to have a paddle right here. But for me, because I am a bit taller and I do have longer arms, like you were saying, is I can reach closer to the hole and get around it better. And so I get a little more power with that higher angle, so I can get away with a shorter paddle. Where if you're more of a relaxed paddle or a low angle paddle where you're not turning the paddle up, kind of almost vertically, you're reaching out a little longer. So
the vertical paddle position also keeps your boat straighter.
Right.
So if you've got a shorter boat, what you want is a shorter paddle to be able to get closer to a more narrow boat and a shorter boat. You want to have that paddle a little bit higher so you can pull without turning the boat every second. And again, repeating, the shorter the boat, the quicker it's going to turn. The longer boats, you can get away with the really long 250s and 245s to 250s, and you can keep your stroke wide, which is more comfortable. And actually you can get better turning from it and stuff like that. But
and then the high seat position too on boats today, I think also play a part in that. And you would think, high seat, maybe I need a longer paddle, but sometimes I find that when I'm in the high position, I can shorten my paddle because my angle to the water is steeper. Therefore, I've got more of a high angle stroke. Then if I'm lower in the boat, I'm having to either reach up to get that high angle versus if I'm sitting higher, it's just easier. So I don't always find that you need a longer paddle necessarily for a higher seat position. But again, I think that depends on your arm length and that kind of thing. And the nice thing is that there are some, because there's so much adjustment in the seat, and you may have a river boat that's short and a longer, narrower boat for your longer distance paddling. Some of the paddles out there now have the adjustable length ferrules. I know Warner and Branches both have those. This is a Bending Branches ferrule plus, so you can actually adjust that length. It adds some weight to it, but what I like about it is, now if I'm switching kayaks or whatever, I have a little bit of adjustment there to kind of dial it in to fit me better.
So for me, weight, unless you're doing like extremely long expeditions, and you're on the river daily, you're going to get muscle fatigue. But if you're on the water that much, your muscles are going to accommodate. You're going to build muscle. You're going to be able to carry. You can pull a wood paddle for 5 days. So we're definitely spoilt today with even, I would say that the lower price paddles, and those things. If you're paddling every day, you're going to get used to the weight.
Right.
Weight is not a real big factor for me. Like I said, unless I'm doing a 5 day, 6 day straight expedition around an island, and my muscles aren't used to paddling that long. Weight isn't a huge thing for me, and the differences between the brands right now and weight is not that much.
I think when you're touching on that, though, it is to be said that there are good brands that even their lower price point paddles
they're great.
Are really great paddles.
This is kind of what I'm saying.
But then there's brands that when you say lower price point paddle, we're not talking about the $40 and $50 price point paddles. We're talking about Warner, Bending Branches, like paddle companies. That's what they specialize in, and even their price point paddles are going to be hands down above the best you could buy from an off brand or whatever name.
You can't go wrong. It's and I saw a question go about the
I was gonna touch on that.
Pedal drives and what paddles to have for pedal drive. I mean, the reality is, if your mechanics fail, every brand's mechanics fail. Things happen out there. You want to have a paddle every time you go out. I don't care what boat you're on, but having a paddle with a flimsy blade, like the unmentionable brand out there with that paddle that comes with their boat, don't take that one out. Especially if you're going into dangerous waters or you need to get back home, get a
trustworthy
paddle. It's going to be your friend for sure.
You don't have to go full all out $500 solid carbon blades. You're mostly using the pedal drive, but it is worth having a quality paddle. It's going to last you a lifetime if you get
so to answer Aaron's question, the one criteria that I do think is helpful, if anything, is having a break apart paddle for a pedal drive system. It doesn't matter what boat you're in, having that paddle sitting next to you and not using it all day long is a bit of a pain. You're wasting space and stuff like that. If you can afford it, get a break apart paddle, put it behind you, get it set up somewhere else so it's out of your way, and you get the convenience of your deck in front of you versus having to flog that paddle. I definitely would go spend my money on break apart versus high end.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Now having the ability to travel with it and store it is key for sure. Mm-hmm. And there's different. So, when you're saying that about lightweight, tends to also go along with stiffness in the blade. And so like a carbon blade, I do feel more efficient when I have a stiffer blade, but that doesn't always make sense. Like if I'm paddling around where I'm going to be standing up and pushing off things with my paddle, usually more as a tool than just a paddle, like I would if I was just kayaking. I tend to like having a blade that's going to be durable in that situation. And that's why the blade that I have here is this wood blade. And it actually, believe it or not, it's like one of the most durable blades. They've got it tipped with the rock guard. And I push off oysters and rocks with it all the time. but also like a carbon bonded or like stiffer plastic type blade.
Yeah, your paddle is going to get you out there to the spot. So, if there's a race to the spot, if you're a tournament angler and you want to be a little bit more performant, you want to race to the spot, yeah, a more performant blade is going to help you out.
Right.
But once you get to the spot, it's funny how we kick the crap out of our paddles.
Right.
I mean, I don't have oysters where I'm at. I got volcanic rock, and especially in the old days, the old days of fiberglass that we'd have to repair. You're dinging the end of your kayak, so whatever I do, look for how the shape of the blade is a big factor. And, so I have a couple of shapes that I kind of look forward to. I look at, so for whitewater, I like to, I'd like to have, hold on, let me grab my paddle. Well, actually, you kind of look at your paddle. So this, I'm pointing at it because everybody can see what I'm pointing at right now. Here, hold on.
While you're grabbing that, I'll just quickly mention, the Navigator here, this is the Navigator Angler. They have a Navigator that has a more skinny.
I'm in this little office here.
A skinny, longer blade, which tends to be that more low angle blade. This is a little bit more of a high angle blade, but when you get to whitewater, and he's got the Pro there, which is the same essential blade shape as this Navigator is. Yeah. It's almost a combination of the wider. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's this curve here. Well, you can actually see the wear. Look at that.
Oh yeah, the same here. I mean, I beat the crap out of this thing. Like you guys can see it. But.
When you're in shallow water, this becomes a factor here. This bottom part, this shape here. I know Bending Branches and both Bending Branches and Werner come from whitewater backgrounds, and that's where you see the whitewater blades a little bit different because they're always in shallow water, right? So when your paddle's in the water like this, you want to have the least amount of exposure to those rocks in that shallow water. So this allows you to get more paddle blade in the water before you hit bottom,
right?
If that makes sense. So, when it comes to blade selection, again, it's about where you're paddling. And, if you're in the flats in Louisiana, for example, and you're pushing through mud and you're going over, oyster bars and stuff like that, you got a bunch of things to keep in mind. A big wide paddle in all that mud is going to slow you down because you're pulling and then you're pulling out. You want to have a kind of a smaller diameter or width in a blade. They're more effective, and they're going to go lower in the water and give you more power.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people spend a lot of time standing up. So when you're standing up, that's a whole nother challenge. Then you want to have something almost akin to a sup paddle, right? So standing up with a thin, narrow paddle is frustrating because you don't get all that crank and you end up bending the shaft a little too much. But if you get a wider blade and you're spending your time standing up, you can get a lot more ply on the water and push yourself around, deal with the wind because wind's going to hit you when you're standing and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, it's all about figuring out your own shtick,
Yeah, I think if you go with one of the, like we mentioned, the premium brands and get what you can afford and what makes sense for where you're using it as far as the blade materials. Jim actually made a comment, Jim Sands made a comment that carbon's a lot tougher than people think, and it is. It's very strong. And I kind of recommend going to at least a carbon shaft just because it's a little lighter. It's and then you can play around with the blade to get still a great paddle even at a better price point. But you can't go wrong with them, and that's usually one of the things that most people end up upgrading. So if you know that one feels good, if you pick up a paddle and you're like, this feels really great, I like paddling with it, then go ahead and spend the money because you're going to end up, if you don't get when I say quality, I mean, I'm not saying you got to spend a ton of money, but if you don't get a quality brand, you'll end up being unhappy with your paddle and you're going to end up buying it twice instead of.
Well, and you don't get to buy it until you get home. Right. So that's for me the big thing, when it comes to trusting your paddle, or this is a whole nother conversation. you know, you're going out there, you're in the middle of nowhere, you've got the okay paddle, you know, depends where you're fishing and everything, but the worst thing is to break a paddle in half because you're pushing off of a, you know, pushing out of the weeds. We've all done it. We stick our paddle down about 4 feet into the muck, and you think, I got another foot I could push. You know, if you got a cheap paddle, it's going to break. And then you're doing this, you know, we call it C1 in the whitewater world.
Your canoe paddling a kayak.
Your canoe paddling a kayak, and it's mathematically 50% effective.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Don't know how I came up with that number, but so, you know, it is, kayak paddle is a safety feature. You know, you want, whether you're in a pedal drive boat, don't settle for the store-bought. Get a good quality.
You hope
paddle.
you don't need it, but when you do, you need it. That's all you got.
One time. And you don't want to be towed home by James into Jackson.
Yeah. I love doing that to people. If I get to tow them, I get to.
Good question, Dave.
So Dave was asking this, and he's asked it a couple times. So he's definitely looking for that paddle. And I was going to get to it there, Dave. But for me, I go as long. The longest one I have in my shop is 260, and that one will do it. I don't know that I don't know if there's a manufacturer that makes a longer paddle than 260. I'm not usually using the paddle to move the boat, you know, like I would in a kayak. I'm not sitting in the seat and paddling. I'm standing up, typically paddling. But even then, where you would think a stand-up paddleboard paddle would work, it would. But I like the 260 because I can use it as a stand-up paddleboard paddle, but I have even more length. So when I stand on top of my cooler to sight fish or whatever, I have that extra length. And so that 260, and if you can find a longer one, do it. But that's where I've been with the Blue Sky as far as
there's a couple of adjustable sup paddle manufacturers. You're not going to get to both sides of your boat anyway. I mean, you can.
You're doing the whole like reach over here paddle.
You kind of can do that, and honestly, it's going to depend on your day. If your wind is blowing in the wrong direction, you're trying to use the sup paddle to get back home in Blue Sky, you're going to take a little while. So you'd like to get to both sides of the boat, but in general, I use a stand-up paddle. I've got an Aquabound that extends to pretty long. And the good thing about the stand-up paddles is they're really bomber. They're actually uber thick because you're using a C1 blade or a canoe-style blade. You're putting a lot more torque on it because you're using your whole body to turn into that pole, not just your upper body. So when you're sitting down and you're paddling, you're just using your upper torso. When you're standing up, and the reason stand-up paddleboards became a fitness thing is because you're using your whole body. You got your legs digging in, you got your arm digging in, and everything. And if you got, you know, I'll use the name Lightning paddles. They don't exist anymore, I don't think. But I had, you know, those things will break. The carbon will just, it actually, I pulled so hard one time that it opened up vertically, cracked vertically, and then stuck onto my hand. And it like I was holding it like this. It was like,
or it was holding you. It sounds like
I was like this. It was like stuck on my hand, and I had to literally torque it to pull my hand off. And it was
buy good brands, guys.
Yeah. So
Emma's joining us from across the pond there.
Hi, Emma.
Emma's one of our team members.
But I do like the stand-up paddleboard on the Blue Sky is pretty good. You can just put it away and like you crank it down to like 4 feet long and just put it behind you, kind of thing. It gets it out of the way. Our long paddle's good too.
Yeah. So I was just looking through the comments. Want to make sure we're not missing anything. Aaron says he's got a 240 for his Coosa FD, and he feels like he needs a 250 or 260. I would. Probably say that on that boat is a bit wider with that super high seat as well. Again, you're hoping you don't need it, but that boat actually doesn't paddle bad. I paddled the Cruise FD quite a bit going down rivers and stuff when the drive didn't make sense, and I just left it in the truck and paddled that boat.
In his case, I'd almost ask how tall he is, because if he's feeling he's reaching with the 240, it could be you're always in the high position seat, so you're reaching down and you're kind of feeling, you know, it's good to paddle, to be able to paddle to in a natural seating position. So just as a side note, if I use high-low seatings all the time, especially with fly fishing. But when I kayak across a good distance, I'm always dropping the seat.
Yeah.
It really it is night and day. Those 3 or 4 inches makes a big difference in how your body is pulling the water.
Yeah. It's a wind thing
like
too. If you're dropping it down and you don't think. And I want to touch on that because as we get into now that you've got your paddle, there's a couple of things that you'll notice on most paddles, all of them, even if it's a push button or this style where it's like kind of a twist and lock.
Yep.
You've got what's called a ferrule. So you've got adjustment so you can actually adjust. That's right. And hold it upside down, as what Jim was saying earlier.
Do it.
Hold it right side up. So what Jim was saying earlier about upside down, if you were looking at the words and they're upside down, the paddle's probably
right side up. So
well, usually there's a logo on the back of the paddle, but this one doesn't have one. This was the first production one or pre-production one from them. But
pre-production version.
Yeah, sorry. But the reason is the shape of the blade and the way it's curved. You can see the curve. You want that curve towards you, and that kind of tapered off and down, and that just helps how it cuts through the water and how you lift out of the water.
The other indicator that you've got it upside down is typically you feel the flutter.
Yeah,
like if
and what I'm talking about is it vibrating kind of back and forth as you paddle.
It's kind of like you've put the nuts on your wheel wrong and the wheel's not aligned.
So I wanted to
go back,
just make sure I'm not missing because we got a lot of good comments coming in. So Aaron says, do you prefer a T-handle when standing? I do like a T-handle, but typically just because I have the regular kayak paddle with me, I've managed to make that work, and I just kind of grip the top of the blade right here, and that, you got a good paddle blade, that's fine, and it works. So I don't feel like I'm missing the T-handle, and I'm not going to carry two paddles with me. And there's some manufacturers that make that transitional one, but you still have to carry extra pieces. So I just like having that.
If your primary mode of propulsion is the paddle, get a good paddle and use that for stand up for sure. Blue Sky is obviously the exception, and pedal drive is too. But again, if you're going out, far, and you're on a pedal drive or using a motor, and something goes wrong with the motor or your propulsion, you don't want a T-grip to get home. You want to have a pedal for sure.
Yeah, you want to have that for sure. I'm just throwing some comments up here. We got people watching again from Puerto Rico. We got a couple of people watching from Puerto Rico. It's one of our team members down there.
I'm big in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Thanks,
so Aaron
Jim.
says he's 6'2", 270 pounds. Yeah, get you a 250, 260, somewhere around there. And actually, you could get one that would adjust. That would help you a lot. Chris Funk says he uses a 250 in the Cusa HD, or FD is what he meant to say there, in Panama, I do believe, since he said over in Panama. Jim says he uses a SUP paddle on the Blue Sky. I like the 260 kayak paddle for extra length. So there's a couple of good questions here. I'm just looking to make sure I'm not missing anything. All right, so Chris Funk said earlier in the comments that the wind bugged him, and we just mentioned that even lowering that seat down a little bit helps. But one of the things I think that's neglected, and I don't see a lot of people doing it, and it to me, I feel a huge difference when I do it, is adjusting the ferrule. And when I say that, the angle of the blades to each other. So when they're straight at like 0 degree, they're both straight up and down. Where they're matching, the angle is, both of them are flat. But then when you adjust it, one's going to be slightly off, and you can adjust it. On some paddles, it's going to be like a set 30 degree, 0, 30, or whatever, or 45. And others, like this one, you've got, like, you can adjust it in increments to really kind of dial it in. Yep. But I find that 30 degree angle is like perfect for me, and I just get used to paddling that all the time. And what I'm talking about, and you can touch on this probably a little bit more, is it's crazy how much wind resistance when that blade's up in the air that you're feeling like pushed back against that blade when you're trying to pull it and push it. You're trying to push the one in the air forward and pull the one in the water backwards.
Yeah. So you and I both know that every time we travel with Jim, there's going to be wind. So you have a choice. You can either push your paddle blade into the wind like this, or you can tweak your wrist and.
I'm not doing any twerking. I'll tweak it.
There's no twerking. You know, slice it through the wind. So it's the same thing with water. You know, wind has less resistance than the water, but it's still a lot of resistance, as you mentioned. So it's funny, going back to whitewater kayaking. Whitewater kayaking, we used to have 45-degree blades, and and mostly because that's where kayaking came from. You know, those first crazy buggers, ironically, fishing kayak anglers who went after whales. The first sleigh ride was in Alaska way back in like the 1700s somewhere. But you know, they figured the wind thing out a long time ago.
Right.
And both because they're traversing crazy, huge, bodies of water and tides and wind and, you name it, they had to face it. So it was brought into whitewater kayaking, and my first paddle was 45. And for me, it just didn't make sense, but you kind of got used to. So when you're paddling with that setup, you're actually releasing one hand a little bit. So you have a strong arm. So you take your right hand, and then you're releasing, the opposite hand. You're always moving your I'm trying to show you with the camera. You're always
hold on a second. I'll give you full screen.
There you go. You're always you're always so when you're paddling, your strong hands, the blade going in the water, you're always releasing the one hand, closing it, and twisting. So there's a little bit of twisting happening with the one wrist.
It's something you get used to, though, and I know sometimes if I get used to doing it, and if I don't have my paddle set up that way, the first stroke I'll just I'm completely slice through the water.
Yeah.
Or I'm not.
The other solution is to work out a little bit.
Yeah, well,
the full screen takes full advantage of the fact that
definitely going to take that back away from you. Yep, you lost the privileges.
Push any blade through any wind. What are you talking about?
So what you're talking about too with the grit, and I see this all the time, and I learned this the hard way. But people give it the old death grip when they're paddling, and when you're moving that paddle, you can kind of see here it like puts your wrist in this like awkward, weird position. And I know Jim loves like a bent shaft paddle, but the issue I think with bent shafts is you really got to dial in the paddle length for your kayak if you're going to go with a bent shaft, which does help with that right there where you're seeing my wrist like as I go forward. But if you want to have that adjustment and don't want to spend the extra money that bent shafts usually cost, the trick is to just lightly grip the paddle. So you're not like I don't even close my 3 fingers typically on the paddle, and sometimes I'll even kind of do the thumb over. But you're letting that paddle move in your hand so that when you're lightly gripping it, that paddle, I'm trying to keep now, I'm going to get full screen. So when you're moving that paddle, you can let that paddle like adjust in your hand without having to put that added pressure on your wrist. So don't do the death grip. Don't grab it and just like, I got to torque through it. You're pushing and pulling. You can pull with a couple of fingers and push with your other hand, like without even gripping.
I typically let it loose when I'm not using the hand. That hand when it's not in the water, when that blade is not in the water, I'll let it nice and loose for a bunch of reasons. But when it goes into the water, I'll finalize my grip. I'll put my whole. I'll never pull this way unless I've got blisters, but I'll use my full grip. There's a couple of things when it comes to effective paddling for whatever blade you guys choose to own. So we touched on it at the beginning of the show in that most kayak anglers come from fishing versus kayaking. And one of the basics there's 2 basics in paddling that we know as kayakers, but are not necessarily immediately brought into your life as a kayak angler. And one is called the paddler's box. And you were showing earlier how you're grabbing, your wrist, keeping it. You're actually demoing it like this, probably because you're too close to your camera.
Right.
But when you're kayaking, the strength is from not just your arm. It's not from your arms. It's mostly from your shoulders and your core. So the paddler's box is basically this square that your hands move around as you're paddling. And there's a lot of really great videos. If you Google paddler's box, this is kind of a very core part of teaching people to how to paddle for the first time. So you're actually keeping your arms fairly straight, and you really see it when you watch someone who's like a slalom boater or these flat water racing guys. They don't, they don't do this with their arms at all. Right. They're actually straight out, and they're doing this box. Their hands, and you recognize the pattern probably right away because I look so good doing it. But you'll see that it's my body turning. My hands are pretty straight. So the emphasis is on most of your bigger muscles. Yep. So your wrists aren't big. Even your forearms aren't big, but your shoulders are, your back is, and your stomach is. And that's the basic group of muscles you want to use. And what that does is avoids fatigue. If you do this all the way to the shore from, for a full day, you're going to get tired. But if you're using the larger muscle groups in your body, you're gonna have a lot more stamina.
Yeah, and I think something like I've heard it called torso rotation, where basically you're not locking your arms out necessarily. They may have a little bit of bend where it's comfortable, but think about that, and then wherever that bend is, you're not really bending your arm. The only time I really bend my arm is like once I'm like ready to lift the paddle out of the water. That arm may bend a little to help with that lift, but for the most part, you're putting it in, close to your heel and drawing all the way back to your hip. And all that bending, all that movement is in your waist and up. So you're taking your torso and you're turning that to get that power into it. And then
a neat trick
way less fatigue
is to look at your life. Yeah, a neat trick is to look at your life vest. They always have a V here. And if your life vest is sitting straight, that means you're not using any of the bigger muscle groups in your body. But if all of a sudden you see that going, 25, 35% back and forth like that, then you kind of, then you recognize that your back's involved, your stomach's involved, your arms are involved, your shoulders involved, everything's involved. Then you're not reliant on just one little, I've seen wrists only out there, so, and it's all about that evolution into being a kayaker versus just a fisherman.
Well, it's going to make you more efficient. And I think once you get that movement down, and I've seen this, people say, oh, well, kayaking is a good exercise. And I'm not saying it's not good exercise, but once you get that movement down and you realize how much more efficient you can be by utilizing your bigger muscle groups, you can do it like inevitably. You can just paddle and paddle and paddle and paddle.
Well, you can go farther.
Your muscle memory learns those movements and how to do them efficiently, and you're no longer like feeling sore at the end of the day, and you're not hurting things. When you're putting that much pressure on your wrist or your smaller muscle groups, especially your wrist, if you're trying to do it like that, and your wrist is and your death grip in the paddle, you're going to end up hurting something or breaking something down that is going to affect you in the long run versus being able to just paddle for days without fatigue.
Yeah, relaxation is a big deal, and in whitewater, if you're going down the river and you're sitting in your boat and you go over a wave and your body is super taut, you go over a wave and you're stiff, you're going to go over. Your body's going to pull you right over. But if you keep everything relaxed and you go over the wave, and that's another big exercise to do. It'd be really, it's confidence inspiring, but it's also really good for the way you paddle is to relax in your boat, keep that upper torso loose, keep your back loose, keep your arms loose, and paddling this way really does that. Helps.
Chris says even a fat guy can go far on a big boat. Chris has lost a lot of weight. He's not a fat guy. But
just fat-ish.
PHAT, pretty hot and something.
Right. Is that what that means? Oh, I didn't know that.
I think that's what it means. It does now. So we've wasted. No, we haven't wasted. We've given some good information for the last 50 minutes. But I wanted to touch on a couple of, and let's go with 4 or 5 of your go-to strokes that'll help people position and maintain their boat. It doesn't have to be just a stroke. Like also, I know you've mentioned having an active blade in the water with stability when you're in a wave situation when you're fishing like offshore to be able to brace and stuff. But give me like 4 or 5 go-to strokes that you use almost every time you go out that might help someone just be more efficient and keep their boat position a little bit better?
Well, forward and backwards. That's
Okay.
two, so that's make it really easy. So active blade is the biggest one for me. So I come from a whitewater world, and what we were talking about earlier, I was just watching myself in Los Buses with Robert Field, and there was a scene where Robert I think he just released a rooster fish, and he was turning around laughing at the guys. He was pedaling away, and his whole boat just went, whoa. And that day there was wind coming from one direction, current coming from another direction. It was called what they call reactionary waves. And the reactionary waves were so steep that everybody was going over. And if you don't have your when you have a blade in the water, nothing should knock you over. Unless of course you're in a 10-foot surf going in towards the shore, then it's kind of like, oh God, I hope I got it. But out there on the swell, if you got a blade in the water, and that's where I'm the most comfortable, that's for me the number one rule. And I do a lot of whitewater. I still I have an old OG Kusa, and I run the Ottawa, and nothing knocks me over unless my blade's in the air. And so stability is a big thing for me. When it comes to fishing technique, dealing with wind and all that kind of stuff, especially if you're bass fishing, you're always trying to position yourself either to throw into the weeds or to throw along the weeds or to find, depending where the fish are that day, find that position. The stroke I use a lot is the draw.
Yeah.
And I'm fancy, so I scull draw. So it's a feathering in the water. It's basically, whoops, I hope I get this now. You're moving the blade back and forth, and you're pulling a little bit, but you're just using the blade pattern, the blade strength to pull yourself in one direction or other, reposition myself. I don't use a power pull, but I use the micro anchor to lock myself in spots. But I move a lot around that way for two reasons. One, it's actually pretty quiet. A lot of people will try to, when they get to a spot and they're like, okay, I just did those weeds, so I need to go 5 feet that way and do those weeds, instead of like cranking backwards, paddling, making a whole bunch of noise, and then setting up again, back paddling, forward paddling, turning. You do a little draw stroke, little feather draw, and you're just basically sidling along. Takes you a little bit longer. Actually, it probably doesn't, because you go there a lot more direct. Yeah. You settle in and you cast again. So that's a big one for me.
It's a good one too when you're trying to like get beside of your buddy to hand a drink off or grab a lure or deal with a fish. But basically, another one similar to that you're talking about that I use, and I learned this one actually from watching a Kayak fishing show. I'll put myself on full screen. So what you were talking about is kind of feathering back and forth, so you're slicing through the water. Of course, I'm holding this up for the camera, so this is not completely accurate. But you can also kind of reach above the water, dig in, pull the paddle blade straight to your hip, and then without lifting it out of the water, turn it on its side so it slices back through the water, go back away from the kayak, turn it, and pull again. Yep. And you can just continually do that and kind of do the same thing that you're talking about, probably a little bit more aggressive and takes a little bit, more muscle, which I have. But
I just like the feather. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you like the feathers. But it's another same principle of trying to get the boat to go sideways, so you're not having to back out or turn the whole boat and go and then turn it back because you want to face that bank, or you want to get side by side with one of your buddies or whatever. So it's a good stroke, I think, to know for sure. I use it a lot.
Yep. Other than that, you're kind of just getting around. I just prefer personally the continual activity that my body is involved in when it comes to kayaking, when it comes to paddling. I joke, all joking aside, I joke with a lot of people. I say, when I'm on a pedal drive boat, I don't know what to do with my hands. I really don't. I find it's like 50% of my day is missing.
Yeah.
And it's really good exercise. Your legs are a large muscle group. You're going to not burn as much. You're not going to, it depends on where you're going, obviously. But paddling has always been a big part of what I need to do out there. So And I'm used to dealing with, Jim taught me how to troll for big monsters with the rod under my arm. You kind of get used to not having hands free.
Yeah.
And
well, there's times when there are times when I love having the pedal option. But there are also times when the paddle just makes more sense. And if I'm going to one of my local rivers or a small pond or something like that, I love just taking the paddle and the kayak. It's simple. It's not as heavy. The boat's usually lighter. Also, it's less expensive. So people that are getting into kayak fishing, you can get a kayak and a paddle and a life jacket and you're ready to go. And
it's expense, it's weight, but it's, the other thing is I swing both ways, right? So I fly fish 50% of the time. What? I'm your boss. I can say these things.
Yeah, whatever.
I fly fish, 50% of the time. Last year, probably 60, 70% of the time.
Yeah.
And, having a drive in front of me is not really conducive. So,
right.
Anyways, that's the thing. Yeah.
Jen Ripple has joined us.
Hi, Jen.
Jen, hope you're doing well. She said that my paddle was beautiful. I'm assuming she's talking about mine because it is this beautiful wood-bladed paddle. Do you find the pedal makes it difficult when fly fishing? And I mean, anything that's in front of me when I'm fly fishing, 100% makes it difficult. If I'm wearing no shoes, I will get fly line wrapped around my pinky toe, like guaranteed every time.
Pedal drives and mangrove trees.
Yeah. Now, I will say, and this is off topic from paddling tips, but I watched Drew Ross do this simple trick or tip, if you will. When using a pedal drive, he carries a small towel with him, and he just throws the towel over his entire pedal drive in the boat, and no line gets attached to it. But now, Drew Ross is kind of a freak of nature when it comes to the ability to catch fish on fly. He's no world champion, James, but he's probably the next best thing.
Well, first of all, I'm Canadian. We don't throw the towel in. It's a thing.
I'd say he threw it in. He throws it on.
Whatever. There's no towels being thrown.
But it does work. And I saw him do it. I'm like, well, that's so simple and so easy that why would you not it made so much sense.
All right.
But hopefully these tips have helped. There's, like we said, show them the book that you had there. If you can still find it. Actually, Camille's one of our sales reps. Her husband, Scott, was one of the authors of that book. And there's a lot of great information. It's an older book. But this is back what I would call the OGs of kayak fishing, and they were using some of the more narrow, longer boats, not like the wide boats we have now, but a lot of great information on paddling techniques and things that you may not think of when you're just talking about fishing, because you get caught up in, what knots do I need to tie? What rod and reel setup do I need? But you need to think about the paddle and the kayak, the right kayak for the right situation, the right paddle for the right kayak and for yourself. And even the right PFD when it comes down to making sure it's comfortable and it fits you properly so that when you do need it, it works. So there's so many things to that. The other thing that I said earlier was that paddle TV. Was it paddle TV? I'm going to get it right this time. Paddle tails.
Paddle tails.
I'm murdering it. I'm going to pull it up there because I want to make.
While you're doing that, I think my 3 basic rules are going to be, at the end of the day, it's going to be how comfortable you are with the paddle. It's going to be about a combination of what you get used to, what your boat is all about, and where you're going to kayak. So you're choosing your paddle, and honestly, the longer you kayak with the paddle, the more you're going to know exactly what paddle you want. So that's the thing for sure. It is.
Paddle TV is actually the YouTube channel. So I'm going to actually screen share that there. That's the YouTube channel. It's Paddle TV. And then Paddling Tales is one of their kind of things that they have, series that they have on the channel. But that's Ken Whiting. He's a real world champion paddler. Ken Whiting, world champion whitewater paddler.
If you go to paddleeducation.com as well, there is actually a whole curriculum for kayak fishing there. Forward stroke, backward stroke, safety, you name it, it's all there. Paddleeducation.com.
Paddleeducation.com. I'm going to actually put that in the comments.
Yeah.
Paddle. How do you spell education?
There we go.
There it is. I put that in the comments, paddleeducation.com. So there's a lot of great information. Don't get stuck putting the word fishing in your Google when you're looking up these different things, because unfortunately there's not a lot out there as far as people teaching kayak fishing that include the techniques and tips for choosing the right paddle and the right blade and things that will help you be more efficient and less tired out on the water. So
which is
great resources.
Which is honestly crazy for the size of the industry right now.
Yeah,
you know, we're a big industry, but there's a new article that I wrote coming out in Paddle World magazine that kind of, in a very comedic fashion, explains what I see as the evolution of fishermen through to anglers. And all joking aside, it's a really interesting study for me, watching people hop into a kayak for the first time for whatever reason, whether it's expensive boats or whatever, and seeing them slowly evolve into becoming kayakers. It's a beautiful thing. I like watching it.
Yeah, so I'm going to touch on that real quick. When we were this has been a few years back, but when we were in Sweden, right? I was like drinking and train riding. But when we were over there for the Liska Open, what I was really impressed with was that everybody there was a kayaker. Like they were kayak fishermen, but they were kayakers. They knew how to paddle. They knew they had the appropriate gear. Like when I say gear, I'm talking it was cold water, and they had the right gear to be able. If they went in the water, they were going to be safe. They had food with them. They had ways to start fires. They had change of clothes. I mean, they were kayakers and fishermen, and they combined the two great. Where here, you see so many times great fishermen that just didn't take into the consideration the fact that they're going to be in a kayak all day, and they might be out there in jeans and boots, and the water temps 50 degrees, but it's nice out, so they're fine. They think, oh, I'm fine, but then you go in and they're not prepared. So I think it is the progression, and it makes you a better kayak fisherman if you know how to. You wouldn't go on a boat, you wouldn't go on a bass boat and try to fish off a bass boat without knowing how to drive a bass boat. So
here's the bottom line: is when you're that close to the water and you're that intimate with the conditions, you don't just get to know what you need to. You're a little bit more preparatory. You just need. you just need seahorse. You just need to. You start to adapt. You start to figure stuff out, and it's kind of like this thing we used to say in the beginning of kayak fishing marketing, where you're closer to the fish, that kind of stuff. You really are. You're completely involved in the conditions that are of the water, how cold it is, how much wind, what the weather's going to be like within the next few hours. You can't rip back in a bass boat.
Right.
You're out there, so you plan for it, and then you realize really quickly that you can evolve to another waterways. I've been fishing the inland portion of Louisiana for years, and redfish are right over there. I could just try that. Well, that's a whole nother series of rules that you got to follow, from tide to wind, more wind, right, obviously, and gear. And all of a sudden, I mean, that's the kayaker's lifestyle.
I agree. It's the whole, it opens up the door to so many different fisheries and so many different opportunities. I mean, you can literally take a kayak, throw it on the roof of your truck or whatever, and drive around the entire United States and Canada and fish pretty much every waterway that has fish in it. But you need to know how to deal with different conditions and changing conditions. And if you learn those things, then it opens up so many doors and so many fish.
And when it comes to the fishing, you are learning more about the fishing.
Right.
I think you really are, instead of flogging from a big boat. I think those conditions are connected to the successes you're having on the water catching fish.
Yeah. You don't pay more attention.
You don't notice them when you're protected on a boat. Yeah. You do notice them when you're not protected in a kayak.
You definitely pay a lot more attention to conditions and forecasts. I feel like
I won't go out there anyway because it was windy. Whenever it's windy, the cold front comes in and the bass don't bite at this part of the bay.
Yeah.
Wait, I didn't learn that when I was on a bass boat, because I would rip out there anyway.
Right. Why aren't they biting? Yeah. All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on.
Cheers, man.
Thanks a lot for all the information. And I'm sure if people want to get in touch with you, they can reach out to Sir Indiana. What is your name on Facebook that you would prefer people to reach out to you?
I think it's just James.
Well, you do have an Indiana James Mcbeath.
Yeah, that's my movie star persona. It's not really me.
Yeah, so just reach out to James Mcbeath on Facebook with all your questions.
I'm there all the time. So.
All right.
Yep.
Well, I appreciate it, man. Have
Cheers,
a
buddy.
good one. Grab another beer. All right, guys. Thanks for watching again. Next week, I'm hoping to have our guests lined up to do a crankbait tips. Or let's see, like choosing the right crankbait, the right situation, line, reel combo, all that good stuff. I'm trying to line that up right now. Been talking to Spro. Been using their crankbaits for years. They make great products, but I only use like a couple of different styles because I'm mostly using them in rivers, and there's so many options out there that it's like overwhelming. So I want to have an expert come on and chat about that. So hopefully we'll have that show lined up for next week. If we don't, we'll have another great show of some kind lined up for you guys. A couple of topics I want to cover is organization. I'm not that great at it, but I know someone would benefit from tips from someone that is good at organizing and keeping that tackle ready to grab when you need it. Until then, hope you guys have a good week. Stay healthy, stay safe out there, and it's starting to get sunny and nice out, so get out on the water and enjoy it. Cheers.